It's 2016 and two trains in Germany come together in a major collision on single line bi-directional track. How does that happen in 2016 with all the computers, with all the telecommunications, with all the modern age signalling in one of the most advanced countries in the world? We're not talking about a third world train wreckage here. We're talking about Germany and two trains colliding on single line bi-directional track. Well, in actual fact, this is a very old story. I want you to come with me on a journey now back to 1878 in Australia and see what happened. The year is 1878. The tiny hamlet of Emu Plains sits quietly below the majestic Blue Mountains west of Sydney. On its escarpment sits an engineering feat marked by the Knapsack Gully Viaduct, a magnificent sandstone structure which can be viewed for miles around. Known as the Lapstone Zigzag, the railway line zigzags up the steep escarpment. Its construction was overseen by John Whitten, New South Wales Railway's chief engineer and one of the leading rail engineers in the world during the 19th century. The Blue Mountains line is a single line of track that crosses the Blue Mountains. This is another picture of it taken in the 19th century of the little town called Valley Heights. The Blue Mountains is scattered with little villages like this. The rail line over the Blue Mountains has been constructed by Whitten at a time that would embarrass most engineering firms today. The line reached Penrith at the foot of the mountains by 1862. This is a picture of Penrith Station as it then was. By 1869, the line had completely crossed the mountains to Bowenfels. By 1870 to Rydal. By 1876 to Bathurst, by 1877 to Orange, and by 1881 to Dubbo. Between 1870 and 1880, the passenger rail traffic had gone from 776,707 passenger journeys to 5,440,138 passenger journeys, all in the space of 10 years. So the pressure, not for the last time, was on rail management to make the railways more efficient. With so much traffic, the single lines were inadequate for the increased two-way demand for track access. This demand led to pressure on the safe working systems to free up the flow of traffic. This culminated in a horrific tragedy on the 30th of January 1878, when two trains collided head-on at Emu Plains. At a few minutes after 11 o'clock on Wednesday night, a through goods train collided with an up special goods train at Emu Plains, just at the bottom of the Lapstone Hill incline. The trucks piled up high, one on top of the other, and somehow caught fire, burning fiercely, casting a lurid reflection over the surrounding hills. The merchandise and the coal were in flames and scattered over the line in broken heaps. The engine drivers and the firemen had been cut to pieces. Two political giants ruled the New South Wales Railways. John Whitten, the Chief Engineer, and John Sutherland, the Minister for Railways. John Whitten wanted no change at all. He resisted the idea of staff and ticket. On the other hand, John Sutherland wanted reform. He wanted to have trains that were more freely running, and he wanted more efficient train running. To this end, each tried to exert their influence in the railways. Sutherland appointed Donald Vernon, who introduced working orders, and Whitten acted through Commissioner Ray, who cancelled the very same working orders. Thus the railways were effectively divided into two camps, and the staff didn't know who to follow. So what was the difference between Whitten's regulations and Vernon's working orders? Well, under Whitten's regulations, a train that crossed another train had to arrive 15 minutes before that service was advertised to leave in the other direction. This contrasted with Vernon's working orders, which gave discretion to the guard, and basically said if there was a doubt that a station master should telegraph ahead asking whether the line was clear, and if that clearance came, the 15 minutes could be disregarded, and basically that it was up to the guards to space the trains, provided that they had the written telegraph from the station master assuring them that the line was clear. The problem with telegraphs, of course, is that both parties have to cooperate and send them. And if half the staff are not following the same rules, this is very hard. At Kelso, this blew up on November the 5th, 1877, when Station Master Pass at Kelso sent on a freight train after sending a telegraph, but Station Master Higgs at Bathurst also sent a freight train at the same time, but he didn't send a telegraph. The head-on collision was averted by a horseman who spotted the collision, or potential collision, from a hilltop. Management ramifications for this were very rapid. Vernon immediately blamed Higgs and commended Pass. He suspended Higgs. However, Whitten intervened through Commissioner Ray, and he blamed Pass and reinstated Higgs. Minister Sutherland, whose power was quite in the ascendancy in December, reinstated Pass, promoted Vernon, and demoted Whitten. So now where are we up to? The entire railways is in a mess. The staff don't know who to follow. Some station managers want to follow Commissioner Ray and go to the old regulations. Others want to follow Traffic Manager Vernon and send line clear reports. But the problem is now that with half the station masters not doing line clear reports, even if you wanted to do one as a station master, there's no guarantee that your neighbouring station master will oblige you. And then we have the situation with the guards. Is it up to the guards' discretion or is it not? In other words, the staff don't know who to follow, and as a result, the safe working questions are huge. So now we come to the sad conclusion of the story. This is Locomotive 103, which was involved in the head-on collision. On the evening in question, driver John Egan, his fireman John Larkins, and the guard George Purdue set out from Bowenfells on a special goods train of 9 trucks of kerosene shale oil from Bowenfells. The train passed Katoomba at 8:25, Weatherboard, today known as Wentworth Falls, at 8:50, and arrived at Blue Mountain, today known as Lawson, at 9:25. There, Station Master John King leapt aboard the train, and it was a very slow-moving train, to ask the guard what he intended to do. George Purdue indicated that he would cross the down goods train at Wasco Siding, that is Glenbrook. He would go to Glenbrook and wait for the freight train. Thus, King sent this information to the Penrith station master by telegraph. And from then on, the train's fate was sealed. Somewhere between Lawson and Glenbrook, guard Purdue changed his mind. He must have thought that he could make Penrith, where he lived, by 11 o'clock, but also that this freight train he was crossing was quite often late, so he obviously thought that he could make it in time. His watch was later found to be 25 minutes slow, but surprisingly, in those days, many stations had no clocks at all, including Lawson. 45 minutes was the normal time for going down the Lapstone zigzag, but guard Purdue obviously thought that he could do it in about 15 minutes. Today, the Lapstone zigzag is a walking trail. As we go down the hill, we can imagine what those final moments before the crash would have been like. The driver of the up freight train, Egan, and the fireman of the down freight train, Wiggins, were buried here at Emu Plains Cemetery, very close to the accident site. All up, 5 train crew died. Guard Purdue was charged with manslaughter. At his trial, Defence Counsel raised the management civil war over safe working within the railways as a defence. This was ruled inadmissible by the judge. However, the jury recommended mercy, and guard Purdue was sentenced to 2 years of hard labour at Parramatta Jail. Subsequently, management expedited the introduction of ordinary staff and ticket working and block telegraph working almost immediately, and ordered the required equipment from England. And the ghost of Emu Plains became part of Australian history forever. what are these men doing? Why are they so proud? The year is 1900 and these government-employed rat catchers are standing here displaying their prize catch. The location is the Rocks area of Sydney, where a bubonic plague has broken out. Over 1,300 cases will be reported in the next 20 years. The health authorities are frantically seeking out and exterminating rats. Over 100,000 rats will ultimately be destroyed. They are destroyed in this, Sydney's first dedicated rat furnace. You can imagine the smell of the smoke as it mixes with the aroma of the horse manure in the streets. To fight the plague, the health department sent photographers to some of the poorest areas of the Rocks in Sydney to record the sordid conditions. These photos were in part to justify the rather rigid clean-up campaign, which involved the outright demolition of houses, as well as the spraying of whole streets with disinfectant. This is a typical kitchen in the Rocks at that time, totally filthy. This was a typical backyard, with children laying in the filth and muck. And this was a typical butcher's shop. Anyone for steak and sausages? In response, the health authorities started to tear down unhygienic premises in the name of plague prevention. It could also have been that authorities had one eye on the forthcoming construction of the Harbour Bridge, which, of necessity, would also require the wholesale demolition of many parts of the Rocks. And also many streets and drainage systems were sprayed with disinfectant and cleansing agents, the wholesale effect of which was to seriously impede the plague. In the meantime, there was action happening at the other end of town, where many plague victims were actually buried and new construction was about to occur. After 2 royal commissions, Sydney's third central station was about to be constructed on the old Sandhill Cemetery at Devonshire Street. Up to this point there had been 2 prior Sydney stations. This is the first one that was built in 1855 and lasted through to 1874. And this is the second Sydney Central Railway Station. Built in 1874 and designed by John Whitten, it started off with 2 platforms, ultimately landed up with 13. As you can see, it was a rather magnificent building, but it soon became far too congested for the traffic. It is perhaps pertinent to note here that yesterday's railway workers were not dressed in high visibility vests. Occupational health was not a priority. And so it was that on the 30th of April 1902, Minister O'Sullivan laid the foundation stone for Sydney's third, and up to this point, final central station. And this was the site upon which the new Sydney terminal was to be built. Many famous landmarks. Over here is Belmore Park and Gardner Road, which was to become Eddy Avenue. Here was a women's refuge, one of Sydney's only women's refuges at that time. Over here was a police barracks, housing 100 of the state's finest. And here was Sydney's first steam tram depot. Sydney in the 1800s had used steam trams to haul double-deck carriages around. The double-deck carriages had formerly been hauled by horses. Now the little steam trams ploughed the tram roads. This picture was taken at the corner of Market Street and Elizabeth Street. This picture was taken at the intersection of Oxford Street and Liverpool Street. Again, the cute little steam tram ploughing its way through the city with the beautiful double-deck floats behind. And this was the forebear of the State Transit Authority, a genuine horse bus on the corner of Devonshire Street and George Street. These trams and buses were to evolve into a system of electric trams, like these seen on George Street in Sydney in the late 1890s. And the last area slated for removal for the construction of the new station was the Sandhills Cemetery on Devonshire Street. This cemetery contained bodies that went back to the First Fleet. Sydney's original graveyard had been at Town Hall, but by 1830 it had reached its limits, so the bodies were then dug up and transported here to Devonshire Street. It was called the Sandhills Cemetery because it rested on sandhills. Much of the sandhills would ultimately be dug away in order to construct the station. This is a view of the cemetery from Devonshire Street itself. Today this is actually the site of the pedestrian tunnel. And so the first railway surveyors arrived on the site of the cemetery. At this point in time, relatives were invited to come and collect their bodies of their loved ones. Bodies went everywhere, to Gore Hill Cemetery, to Rookwood Cemetery at Homebush, and of course, if they were unclaimed, to the new Bunurong Cemetery at Botany. On the 7th of February 1901, an article appeared in the Sydney Morning Herald which said, "During the past fortnight, large numbers of people have been daily arriving to give directions as to the disposition of their buried relatives, and the visitors to the cemetery for this purpose are increasing." As progress was made towards the completion of the station, you can see in the far distance of the construction site the Sandhills Cemetery itself stripped bare of bodies and revealed and peeled back to the bare sandhills that were underneath it. On the 4th of August 1906, the new station terminal was now open. At first, trains had to proceed through the second station to arrive at the new Sydney terminal. This is a view of the end of one of the platforms of the current Central Station, looking through at the second Sydney terminal. As finished in 1906, you can see the predominance of the main roof over the structure, And of course you can see that the station is still not what it is today. During World War I, construction of the clock tower started. The clock itself was not to be finished till 1921. Other floors were also added to the building during this period. But in all this, what about the unclaimed bodies? The bodies came out here, to Eastern Suburbs Cemetery. When they moved the bodies, there were some 30-odd thousand headstones. Today, only about 2,000 are left. These poor souls, some of whom had been found buried alive, have finally found their resting place at Botany Cemetery. Many of these graves had been disturbed twice in their existence. Firstly, to be moved from Town Hall to Devonshire Street, and then secondly from Devonshire Street to Botany. There they rest today. In viewing this video, I hope you've been able to appreciate just how hard life must have been for people at the end of the 19th century as well as the early 20th century. And to those people who built New South Wales, this film is dedicated.
I'm here in Sydney's Central Station, and did you know that this is actually the third incarnation of Central Station? The first was built a little bit further south in Redfern along Cleveland Street in 1855, and itself replaced in 1874 by a second station in the same location. Later, the line was extended north past Cleveland Street and over Devonshire Street to Central Station's current location here alongside Eddy Avenue. Devonshire Street underneath the tracks was closed off to cars, leading to the current Devonshire Street pedestrian tunnel. And if you are to take that tunnel west out to Regent Street, you will find the last remaining part of the old Central Station. I'm here at Mortuary Station, the last remaining part of the Rookwood Cemetery line that was built in 1864 in order to service Rookwood Cemetery, located next to Lidcombe Station in Sydney's west. Originally a spur line, trains would depart from the city and stop at stations along the way before terminating at one of the 4 stations on the sprawling 268-hectare site that was Rookwood Cemetery. In 1869, this platform was built on Regent Street, just south of Central Station, and serviced funeral trains bound not just for Rookwood Cemetery, but also Sandgate Cemetery in Newcastle and Warrenora General Cemetery in Sutherland. In 1948, the line was closed with all 4 stations in Rookwood Cemetery dismantled. One of those stations was transported to Canberra and rebuilt as the All Saints Church in 1958. Mortuary Station remains and can be seen from most trains approaching the city on the left-hand side before they reach Central Station. Petersham Station on Sydney's T2 Inner West line has 2 disused elements. The first one, found on the northern side of the tracks along Terminus Street, is this first-class platform. It was the only first-class station built in Sydney during the 19th century, and was built in 1885 after the original Petersham Station was demolished from its original location up on the northern side and rebuilt here as a current island platform. The second element is on the southern side of the station and is this former turnback siding where trains would terminate, turn around and return their journey towards the city. Today it is used as a training facility containing a train on its own set of tracks and a bus. The T1 Northern Line crosses the Parramatta River here between Rhodes and Meadowbank stations, and originally did so on this, the Meadowbank Bridge, which was built in 1886. By 1980, it had been replaced by the adjacent John Whitten Bridge, which carried 2 tracks but had the potential to be expanded to 4. The John Whitten Bridge is named after John Whitten, who was the designer of the original Meadowbank Bridge. In fact, you can still see some evidence of the original tracks just down here, crossing on the Meadowbank Bridge itself. By the year 2000, the Meadowbank Bridge had been refurbished and reopened, and now carries pedestrians and bike riders. The Royal National Park line opened in 1886 and continued to operate until 1991. By 1993, it reopened as part of this, Sydney's Tramway Museum.
Trams like the San Francisco Street Park run once an hour on Sundays and Wednesdays.
The Royal National Park line ran from Loftus to the Royal National Park station, located here, which is the terminus of the tram trips from the Sydney Tramway Museum. The Eastern Suburbs line began construction in 1948, but was not completed until 1979, over 30 years later. 4 platforms were originally planned, 24 through to 27. However, only platforms 24 and 25 were ever built. Evidence of platforms 26 and 27 still exists in the elevator down to platforms 24 and 25, but just like the unused platforms, the button remains inactive. Station was originally built in 1928 and planned with 4 platforms in mind. However, only 2 were ever built. You can still see just behind me one of the 2 tunnel portals where the trains were meant to go through, and another one just over there, with the tracks meant to be running down along through here with the 2 island platforms on either side of me. That means we still have a lot of tunnelling through St James Station that was never used, that has in fact been used for movies such as the Matrix movies or the Australian horror film The Tunnel. The original plan for St James was that these 2 tracks would have a western suburbs line going underneath Parramatta Road and then an eastern suburbs line heading towards Bondi Junction. Wynyard Station originally had 6 platforms. Today it has 4, platforms 3 and 4, and also platforms 5 and 6. Now to find the original platforms 1 and 2, we need to exit the station and go up a set of escalators. Here we are at the original platforms 1 and 2 of Wynyard Station. It no longer looks like platforms 1 and 2, it's now actually a car park. But it was converted into that car park after being used for trams that used to cross the eastern 2 lanes of the bridge, which would terminate here at Wynyard Station, where passengers could get off and change to trains. In fact, you can still see what the tunnels used to look like. Just through here is the iconic archway of Sydney's underground railway tunnels, through which the trams and then hopefully later trains out to the northern beaches would have run. When the Eastern Suburbs line was first built, there was plans for an additional station at Woollahra. That station was never built, but a cutting still exists, and you actually pass through it between Edgecliff Station and Bondi Junction Station. And here is the original site of the Woollahra station. The platform was going to be in the middle. It's all open up, but it was never built. prior to the completion of the Sydney Harbour Bridge in 1932, the North Shore line used to terminate at Milsons Point, where passengers would get off their trains and then board a ferry to go into the city. The only thing is, that Milsons Point station was not this one, it was a little bit further down, close to the harbour. The original site of Milsons Point station was actually right here where the current Milsons Point pool is, just adjacent to Luna Park. The decision to have it here was so that it would be next to the ferry wall, so North Shore line passengers would get off their train here at Milsons Point station and then walk right across over here to Milsons Point ferry wharf and board a ferry to go to Circular Quay. When the current St Leonard station opened in the year 2000, it was built with 2 island platforms. The idea was to extend it out to have 4 separate platforms with 4 separate tracks. You can still see where one of the tracks was meant to be, just over here, which was the location for platform number 1. That's no longer going to happen because the Sydney Metro plan is for an underground station just a little bit further out at Crow's Nest. But it does explain why St Leonard's, lacking a platform 1 and a platform 4, only has platforms 2 and platform 3.